So at this point, we've covered a lot of Symfony. We've gone through numerous components. We've evolved our framework to simplify the actual code that we use to make it more portable. We've gone through multiple iterations of simplifying our code and putting code in the right places. And along the way, you've probably learned a lot about object-oriented programming if you hadn't worked with object orientation before. There's a lot of best practices embedded in the way that Symfony works and the way this tutorial is structured. In the next set of videos, we're going to look at how these various components apply to Drupal 8, but by simply understanding these components, it will make creating new applications easier because you'll know some of the foundational tools that you need in order to build a long-lasting, sustainable, and flexible project. At the very beginning, we stopped using global variables and started using request to grab those variables, and that gave us the freedom to simulate requests. And while we didn't do that a lot, that's really quite powerful. And also, by wrapping everything in objects, we now have the ability to extend the classes that create those objects, to add our own methods, to add our own properties, in addition to using a lot of the built-in tools and methods that are there already. We went through the process of adding a front controller after using an include file, and eventually evolved into a structure of files that is auto-loading compatible, where there's predictable places to put our files and add additional controllers. And this structure, because it's PSR0 compatible, will also be usable in virtually any other project that we want to build off of it, or where we want to use some part of this framework. We went through several steps in evolving our pages into controllers. We started using templates, we started using controller classes, although we also learned how we can use functions, anonymous functions and closures, or custom functions to create controllers as well. After we switched from using our hello and bye pages to using the leap year controller, we looked at how to build unit tests for our framework using PHP unit. I don't know if you're as surprised as I was when I started using it, but it was remarkably simple to set up, and the tests themselves are very easy to create. In fact, a good exercise would be taking the evolved application that we've built and adding some additional tests to it. We then looked at event dispatching, which is the Symfony version of hooks, where you can create an event and then add listeners to that event that get triggered whenever that event gets triggered. We looked at a slightly different structure of a listener, which is called a subscriber, where you can have a subscriber that listens to multiple events and that is responsible for defining its own settings for the listeners. That makes it much more manageable and reusable. After we built up a significant framework, we added a reverse proxy, which is just a fancy word for caching, into our application, and we were able to save the output of our script into files that would then get used for a particular amount of time. Again, one more advantage to using established components. Creating that component yourself would be definitely possible, but it would take a bit of time, and there's some edge cases that you'd have to be aware of that might not be supported out of the box by something that you'd create by hand. We then took all of our framework code that we'd been working on for the entire series, and we got rid of it, and instead started using the HTTP kernel component. In fact, a lot of what we had been building up to had to do with understanding why that HTTP kernel exists and what its role is, and we did that by building it and then replacing it with the existing component. We took that new framework for a ride by adding custom error handling, where we were able to take an error from our leap year controller when we threw it negative values and display something that was in line with the look and feel of our application. We evolved our frameworks another step by allowing it to use strings instead of full response objects, which gave us more control over the response object, because it only got instantiated one time. And whenever we can avoid repeating ourselves, we should. It's the dry principle, which we talked about in the object-oriented programming section. Having everything in one place means that you know that once you find that one place, sometimes it's hard, but when you find it, you know that when you fix something there or adjust it in that one place, that it's good to go, that you don't have to keep looking. In the final steps, what we did was add dependency injection into our application. This basically wraps a singleton pattern around all of our objects, which means that we only instantiate them one time, and then that same instance gets used wherever that object is needed. We don't have to reinstantiate it. Dependency injection also exposes all of our instances of our objects to be able to be adjusted or overridden later, which was one of the things that we were trying to correct from our framework code, where we were instantiating all of these objects and then had no access to them outside of the framework class. So in summary, you've learned a lot, not just about Symfony, but about object orientation in general, and about programming as well. It makes sense to go through this set of exercises a couple of times until you really feel like you get a grasp of the rationale behind each one of the changes that we made, each time that we moved code from one file to another, each time we started using a component instead of our custom code. Those are all things that you can carry with you, even if you're not going to use Symfony, and even if you're not going to be using Drupal 8 for all of your applications. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. It was pretty dense, but there's a lot of good stuff in there, and it was a lot of fun to learn.